Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Sian and I love making content about basically anything creepy, disturbing, morbid things. So if you're into that, then you're definitely in the right place. And if you haven't noticed, I have a new room to film in, which is great. Background is a little bit more boring, but I hope that we get used to it.
I also have a new microphone.
I'm officially back. I was away on holiday for 2 weeks. And I think one more week before that I also didn't film, but I'm back into routine now, so I will be posting regularly again. In Kenya's Kilifi County, a horrible tragedy came to light, one that has deeply disturbed both the nation and the world. Hidden in the Shakahola Forest, dozens of mass graves were found, and this was believed to be linked to a group that turned faith into a tool of unimaginable harm. Followers of this cult were allegedly coerced into starving themselves to death in the belief that they would meet their creator. Their leader now stands accused of crimes including radicalization, mass murder, and abuse of his followers' trust, as authorities work continuously to unravel the full extent of his horrible actions. This is the more lesser, but still so horrifying case of Paul Mackenzie, the leader of Good News International Ministries. So a bit about the background and the history of this cult. Paul Mackenzie, who was the founder of Good News International Ministries, which we can also call GNIM, had a pretty humble beginning to his life. He was born and raised in Kenya and started his career as a taxi driver in Nairobi. From 1997 to 2003, he worked as a driver, but he also preached to those that he encountered. He loved spreading the gospel and speaking about his religion to people around him. He was quite an enthusiastic person, so his sermons quickly gained a lot of attention, but also not entirely for the right reasons. During this whole ordeal of him spreading the gospel, authorities actually charged him 4 times during this period for spreading controversial teachings. However, he never really went to prison and was never really charged each time due to just general lack of evidence. But that didn't scare Mackenzie off. In 2003, Mackenzie decided to formalize his religious activities by officially founding GNIM as a very small church. It began as quite a modest, small operation, but it grew pretty steadily over the years due to Paul being so enthusiastic and so passionate about his sermons. It gained traction pretty quickly. Along with that, people were also very drawn to the fact that Mackenzie claimed that he could communicate directly with God. This assertion obviously gave him a very powerful influence over his followers, many of whom believed he had this divine authority due to his gift. So it was this, along with his charisma and teachings, that helped him build a very loyal congregation. By 2009, Mackenzie had relocated to Migingo village in Malindi. This marked a pretty critical turning point for the church as it began to really thrive in its new location. Reports suggested that his followers were completely obsessed and completely devoted to him. In one notable case from 2016, a member of his church reportedly sold their property on the island of Lamu for 20 million Kenyan shillings and gave that entire sum of money to Mackenzie. Mackenzie used this money to purchase properties in the cities of Mombasa and Malindi, buy vehicles, and to establish a television station to spread his message further. So his followers and the people that were part of his congregation were basically funding him and funding his whole church to be able to spread his message far and wide, that he could communicate with God, and everything just kept on getting bigger and growing. The television station that I mentioned earlier on played a very significant role in expanding Mackenzie's influence. Through broadcasts, he obviously reached a wider audience and attracted a lot more followers. However, as his popularity grew, so did scrutiny from authorities. I mean, they all knew that he was spreading controversial messages before, so he probably still was. In 2017, Mackenzie and his second wife, Joyce Mokamba, faced charges for promoting radicalization, denying children access to healthcare and education, and operating an unauthorized school and television station. And again, nothing really happened with these charges. Mackenzie was acquitted of these charges, but the Kenya Film Classification Board did eventually end up shutting down his television station in 2018. And then later that year, Mackenzie's wife did pass away, which marked a pretty difficult period for him. But in and amongst this, the church's practices continued to raise pretty serious concerns among people that were not part of the congregation and authorities. As the church was growing, several children died due to lack of healthcare within the community, prompting authorities to again intervene in 2017. The authorities rescued a whole 93 children from GNIM who were all fearing for their health and well-being. Community leaders, including Malindi MP Aisha Jamwa, publicly criticized Mackenzie for encouraging children to drop out of school, often without their parents' knowledge or consent. And these children were obviously joining his church and congregation after dropping out of school. So despite all of these controversies and problems and authorities continuously intervening in all of the really dodgy stuff happening in this congregation, Mackenzie's legal troubles very rarely resulted in any significant consequences. He just kept being charged, but nothing really ever happened. He was never arrested, never went to jail, and was basically just being accused of things. Many of the charges were dropped and lots of others ended in acquittals. And throughout it all, his control over his followers remained very strong. No one questioned him. And surprise, surprise, in 2019, Mackenzie found himself at the center of yet another controversy. He spoke out against the government's Huduma Number initiative, comparing it to the biblical mark of the beast. This initiative aimed to revolutionize public service delivery in Kenya through a unified digital identity system. And in this process, the Kenyan government would assign everyone a unique personal identification number, and this would be assigned at birth or upon registration or enrollment in the program. This stance that Mackenzie took resonated with some, but also brought quite a few accusations of incitement. Mackenzie was further accused of brainwashing his group and even abducting children to join his church. Following this controversy and a few people obviously deciding that maybe he wasn't this higher being able to speak directly to God, Mackenzie actually announced the closure of his church in Magingo and moved to the very secluded Shakahola Forest. Despite his claims that GNIM had ceased its operations, reports suggested that he continued to preach and maintain quite a big following in this very remote location. So this Shakahola Forest was now Mackenzie's new HQ, and because it was in such a remote location, I feel like most of the inner happenings of the group were no longer being seen by the public, which is probably part of the reason why what happened to this group actually happened. The people inside the group weren't really being exposed to the outside world anymore, and the outside world had no influence on the inner workings of the group anymore. Anyway, his retreat to Shakahola marked a very significant shift in his ministry, one that would later lead to shocking revelations and a national tragedy. So now that we've covered the base points of how Mackenzie started his group, how he gained his followers, and where the tragedy kind of started happening, I just want to dive a little bit more into the specific beliefs and practices of the group. So surprise, surprise, I feel like it comes up every single time. This group had some apocalyptic beliefs. It sounds like you need some kind of apocalyptic view for your cult to become successful, so just keep that in mind if you're ever thinking of starting one. But one of the central pillars of Mackenzie's teachings was, of course, the belief that the end of the world was imminent. He preached that his followers must prepare for the afterlife because Judgment Day was very near. It's always these doomsday predictions that cause a sense of fear and urgency in their followers, feeling like they need to listen to Mackenzie and they need to stay close. And obviously they felt like without Mackenzie and without him telling them what they need to do to prepare for the end of the world, they were helpless and they couldn't do anything about it. So his congregation obviously felt like they had no time to waste. They had to get started on preparing for Judgment Day. Along with Mackenzie claiming he could speak directly to God, he also claimed to have divine knowledge of the end times and used this to compel followers to abandon their worldly possessions. Again, nothing we haven't heard before. Mackenzie often described the material world as very sinful and completely unworthy of attachment, encouraging his congregation to focus solely on spiritual salvation. So this very apocalyptic narrative became the foundation of GNIM's practices and beliefs. According to the group's website and news media reports, GNIM was pretty heavily influenced by the end-time message of William Branham, an informal global network of churches that emerged from oneness Pentecostalism. Investigators discovered booklets of Branham's teachings at the GNIM commune, which were later pictured in news broadcasts. Mackenzie placed a very profound emphasis on end-time warnings and described the world as irredeemably corrupt. His sermons were also deeply anti-Western, targeting what he called the evils of Western life, including things such as medical services, education, food, sports, music, and what he deemed the uselessness of life. And this obviously explains why the kids that wanted to join the church had to drop out of school, because Mackenzie didn't believe in education. And obviously with education comes the sports and the music and all of those things, so school was a big no-no for Mackenzie. In a song titled The Antichrist, Mackenzie denounced institutions such as the Catholic Church, the United States, and the United Nations as tools of Satan. So this is where things start becoming culty and no longer churchy. This message obviously just isolated the group more and more and further reinforced the very apocalyptic urgency within the community. One media report confirmed that Mackenzie predicted the end of the world would be on April 15th of 2023, and this very specific day claim obviously heightened the desperation and the compliance of his followers. While a majority of the GNIM adherents were Kenyan people, the group's reach actually extended beyond national borders. The group gained followers from Tanzania, Uganda, and people from Nigeria even joined. And this obviously indicated the widespread appeal of Mackenzie's message within the region. So Mackenzie's teachings extended to rejecting many aspects of modern life, which he described as corrupt and ungodly. Like I mentioned earlier, he told his followers to just completely avoid modern medicine, claiming that faith and prayer were the only acceptable forms of healing. This complete rejection of healthcare obviously led to a lot of preventable deaths in the group, as even people with very critical illnesses were completely discouraged from seeking any kind of medical attention. Like I said earlier, Mackenzie also preached against formal education, and he believed that it exposed children to worldly and sinful influences. Parents were urged to immediately pull their children out of school, leaving many young followers illiterate and very dependent on the church. Mackenzie also strongly opposed government initiatives. Like I mentioned earlier, he condemned the Huduma number identification program, and he claimed that registering for this program was the same as pledging allegiance to evil. So many of his followers completely avoided registering for government services as a result, further isolating themselves from mainstream society. I don't really understand this one and why his followers believed that getting a unique identification number was a mark of the beast. This one really surprised me, but moving on. One of the most disturbing aspects of GNIM's practices was the promotion of extreme fasting. Mackenzie taught his followers that fasting was essential for spiritual purity and a guaranteed path to heaven. Followers were encouraged to abstain from food and water for very long periods, sometimes even weeks. This practice was obviously particularly harmful to very vulnerable individuals, including kids, who were coerced into fasting under the pretense of pleasing God. Reports indicate that so many people died from this extreme fasting because of starvation, with Mackenzie allegedly framing these deaths as acts of ultimate devotion. So on top of that, Mackenzie's teachings emphasized complete isolation and complete separation from the broader society, which he described as corrupt and unholy. Followers were actually forced to cut ties from anyone who did not share their beliefs and were not part of the group, including family members. I mean, we've seen it in cults before. This isolation just made it so much easier for Mackenzie to maintain control over his congregation, as followers had very limited access to outside perspectives or support. His followers truly felt that this was the only place that they were accepted, and it's the only place they could be. By isolating his followers, the only thing that mattered was the word of Paul Mackenzie. Like we saw a little bit earlier, financial exploitation was another recurring theme in GNIM. Mackenzie persuaded many of his followers to sell their properties and donate the proceeds to the church. This was framed as an act of faith and a way to secure spiritual blessings. And like I said earlier, someone sold the house for 20 million Kenyan shillings and gave it all to the church. And in the end, Mackenzie demanded absolute obedience from all of his followers, using fear and guilt to ensure obedience. He portrayed himself as the sole interpreter of God's will, making it very difficult for followers to question any of his teachings. Critics argue that his methods were very manipulative, targeting very vulnerable individuals, people who are sick, people who are starving, people with no education, because he made them that way. So over the years, Mackenzie's leadership and teachings obviously pushed GNIM further into extremism. The group's radical practices and very apocalyptic beliefs not only caused harm to its members, but also raised a lot of alarms across the nation. As the group now moved into the Shakahola Forest, the practices became very secretive and very dangerous, ultimately leading to a very horrible tragedy, which we're going to dive into now. So in April of 2023, a man reported to Kenyan police that his wife and daughter, who had joined Paul Mackenzie's remote commune in Kilifi County, had not returned home. Deeper investigations into this revealed a complete nightmare. Emaciated survivors and shallow graves scattered throughout the 800-acre Shakahola Forest. Survivors of this tragedy revealed that they had been ordered to starve themselves to death in order to meet Jesus. Of the 15 individuals who were rescued initially, 4 tragically died on the way to the hospital. As police combed the area over the 3 weeks that they were searching, they discovered mass graves and so many followers who were on the brink of death. The graves contained entire families, with one site holding the remains of 3 children and their parents, while another contained 12 children. Many of the bodies were not even buried and showed signs of strangulation, suffocation, and blunt trauma. Survivors recounted such horrifying details, including orders to destroy their government IDs and stay isolated on Mackenzie's farm. Those who resisted the fasting completely were reportedly killed by guards armed with crude weapons. One of the survivors of this tragedy, called Nima, which is of course not her real name, was actually a 29-year-old mother of 4. She joined the commune in late 2022, unaware of all of the horrors that were ahead of her. Once there, members were completely forbidden to leave, and food and water were rationed to starvation levels. Nima described how pregnant women and even breastfeeding mothers were denied sustenance. Guards even ended up raping women, enforcing silence, and they were punished with any attempt at escaping. So Nima and 2 of her friends secretly plotted their escape out of the commune. In their very weakened and starving state, they dug a hole in their hut's wall and fled during the guards' meal break. A passing motorist kindly took them to a nearby hospital, but hundreds of others, including children, were not as fortunate as Nima and her friends. Survivors shared that children were the first to be starved to death, followed by women. So you might be thinking, how did people not see this, and how did the community not know about it? So local villagers were actually for a long time very uneasy about Mackenzie's presence in Shakahola itself. A village elder, Changawa Mangi, recalled how Mackenzie initially claimed he wanted to farm the land. Soon the villagers obviously noticed that he was hosting very large groups of people, but they were reassured when his followers shopped in local stores and kind of just acted like normal people. Over time, however, of course, the visits to the local shops stopped. Emaciated teenagers actually sought refuge with Mangi, but his warnings to authorities were met with very slow responses. And of course, any of the villagers that tried to intervene with Mackenzie's practices were thwarted by all of the armed guards that were stationed around the commune. Stories from all of the grieving families definitely highlight the tragedy's personal toll. For instance, high school teacher Francis Wanji discovered that his daughter and grandchildren had been taken to the Shakahola Forest. Though he did manage to rescue his 9-year-old grandson, he learned that the boy had watched the rest of his siblings starve to death. Another father, Stephen Mwiti, lost his 6 children, including one born in Shakahola itself. It was his wife that took all of his children to the commune. Survivors identified Mwiti's children as being buried in a mass grave with 7 others. So by August of 2023, 429 bodies had been exhumed. Of these, 214 deaths were attributed to starvation, while others resulted from asphyxia, blunt trauma, or other causes. Villagers also reported bodies exposed of in pit latrines, further complicating all of the recovery efforts that the police were already doing. Survivors continued to emerge, but many were too weak to resist the indoctrination. Rescue teams faced a lot of immense challenges when trying to bring survivors out of the cult, as well as looking for more bodies. They faced a lot of resistance from current cult members, and the weather conditions were just really bad. So luckily, this time, Paul Mackenzie was 100% brought to justice for these charges. He murdered a lot of people. So Paul Mackenzie and 29 co-accused have been charged with 191 murders so far. Survivors obviously testified that they were held captive, starved, and brutalized. In court, Nima shared that women were raped while children were the first to be starved. Mackenzie, of course, pleaded not guilty to any charges of murder, terrorism, and child cruelty because he is absolutely psychotic. And this is despite video evidence of his sermons that were referencing sacrifices. Mackenzie denied forcing followers to fast. But this trial also did face a few controversies, such as the initial charging of survivors with attempted suicide. And this obviously drew some widespread criticism because obviously while they were starving themselves to death, it was because Paul was telling them to. But lots of human rights organizations were calling for psychological support instead of any form of punishment. Mackenzie's prolonged detention, among the longest in Kenya's history without any formal charges, was also something that raised some further concerns about due process. In May of 2024, a court streamlined the charges to focus on 12 key cases to avoid any delays. I'm not 100% sure if Paul Mackenzie is currently in prison or if he is still just in detention with trials and, court proceedings still happening. He was charged to 1 year he was sentenced to 1 year in prison in 2023 because he was doing something illegal with film and film studios, but I can't really find anything about his sentencing for the 191 murders that he was charged for. So I'm assuming it's still going on because it is still pretty current. So Kenyan President William Ruto condemned Mackenzie as a very terrible criminal, likened to a terrorist manipulating religion for harm. He actually ended up launching a task force to regulate religious organizations and prevent any future exploitation. Interior Cabinet Secretary Kithure Kindiki echoed these sentiments, emphasizing the need for tighter regulation and very severe punishment for those responsible. So hopefully with these new laws and proceedings in place, this will hopefully not happen again in Kenya. This tragedy obviously left very deep scars on the survivors and families of those who unfortunately died in the tragedy. Nima, who is obviously now free from the cult, is still very traumatized, and she says that she tries to avoid thinking about Mackenzie as much as possible. She's still very afraid of him. The community of Shakahola remains under 24-hour police guard as a crime scene. Mackenzie's church was officially deregistered in May of 2023 as part of a government crackdown on rogue religious organizations. Meanwhile, a second suspected cult in Malindi, led by Pastor Ezekiel Odero, is under investigation for very similar allegations. While connections between the two groups remain unconfirmed, authorities are determined to prevent any further tragedies. So it seems like these kind of doomsday cults that feed off of people who are very vulnerable is quite a common thing in regions like these. And the Shakahola tragedy obviously stands as a very grim reminder of the dangers posed by unchecked religious extremism. And just keep your eyes and ears open for any updates on the legal proceedings. I know I will. This was a really horrible case of so many people who tragically died, and I just found it really sad that they starved themselves to death. It wasn't as if they died a quick death, like by poisoning or anything like that. So I definitely found this one especially disturbing. But let me know what your thoughts are on the case of GNIM and Paul Mackenzie and the absolute monster that he is. I hope he rots in jail. And please let me know if there are any more lesser known cases that you would like for me to do a video on. And I hope that you have an amazing week, and I will see you next week. Bye!